Welcome back, guys, to Dark Night Scare. In today's episode, I'm sharing 9 true disturbing stories about feral people encounters from deep Appalachia. These stories reveal what can happen when people wander into places where they were never meant to be. But before we begin, please consider subscribing and don't forget to like and share it with your friends. Let me know where you're watching from. Thank you all. Now let's start. At 34, I was working in digital marketing for a mid-size agency in Raleigh. I had a decent apartment, a steady paycheck, and a manager who scheduled wellness check-ins, which somewhat made up for the 70-hour work weeks. I didn't have a breakdown one day like people often assume happens with burnout. It was a gradual decline. It began with skipping breakfast, then sleep, and eventually forgetting words mid-sentence. I fainted during a Tuesday status meeting, face first into my keyboard, only to wake up to paramedics and my boss offering me unpaid leave to get my life in order. I didn't argue. 2 days later, I quit. I packed up my Subaru, grabbed Scout, my neglected retriever mix, and hit the road. No plans, no GPS, just old maps, a jumble of camping gear, and a strange urge to disappear for a while. 2 weeks of drifting through Appalachia led me to Limestone Hollow. It was mentioned in the comments of a hiking forum, not listed on park maps and without official trail markers. Someone named Off-Grid Bill dropped a GPS pin with a few blurry photos of moss-covered ridges, a stream, and what resembled ruins engulfed by the forest. Most people overlooked it, while one reply simply cautioned, "Don't." Naturally, I decided to go. I found the access point off Route 74, about an hour past Cold Water. The parking area was just dirt and roots, with no signs except for a warped post that may have once held one. The moment I stepped out, a ranger emerged from a nearby cabin. Mid-60s, tall, built like an oak tree, with a heavy beard and wind-roughened skin. "This trail ain't for visitors," he warned. "Ain't maintained, no markers, no signal. If you go in there, you go alone." I assured him I was fine with that. He didn't nod or blink, merely stared as if expecting me to reconsider. Then he turned and walked away. The trail was narrow, overgrown, and eerily quiet. Not peaceful, just muted. Even Scout was subdued, his ears pinned back, tail low. Regardless, we made camp by early afternoon, finding a wide spot near a stream to set up for a couple of nights with a tarp, hammock, and jet boil. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. Scout played in the water while I took long naps and read a tattered paperback. The forest felt heavy, but not menacing, at least not yet. Everything shifted on the third night. It began just after 2 a.m. Scout, usually a lazy sleeper, bolted upright, not barking, but frozen, ears up, body tense. That's when I heard it. The footsteps. Not animal sounds, just slow, deliberate crunches, one at a time, circling my tent. I barely moved. It circled the tent once, twice, then stopped. Silence reigned, and Scout pressed against me, his tail between his legs. I stayed like that until daylight arrived. Stepping outside, I discovered the prints. Bare feet, widened impressions with fingers almost hand-shaped. Some left drag marks behind them, as if whatever had made them had dropped to all fours. The prints were fresh. I attempted to rationalize it. Perhaps a hermit or an unkempt hiker. I'd encountered strange individuals on trails before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those prints weren't meant for me to see. That night it returned. The same footsteps, the same pacing. But this time, I heard the breathing, ragged and gurgling, like air escaping from a shredded windpipe. Then, a hand pressed against the nylon of my tent. 5 long, thin fingers dragging slowly downward. I flicked on the lantern. Outside, nothing moved, yet the forest felt different, as if it were listening. The next morning, I stumbled across more markings. Trees carved with spirals, crude stick figures having too many limbs, some adorned with small bones tied to the bark. Birds, perhaps. However, one had teeth, human teeth strung on a bit of twine. That was the last straw. I packed my things quickly. Scout stayed close, not barking, but watching the woods, as if anticipating something emerging. The trail back felt wrong. I know that sounds vague, but everything seemed slightly askew. The trees leaned in unusual directions. Pathways I remembered were overgrown, and the creek had vanished. By dusk, I realized I was lost. I didn't bother with the tent, just threw up a tarp, built a massive fire, and sat there with a taser in one hand and a flashlight in the other. That's when the clicking began. Not insects, not birds, just this low, rhythmic sound, almost mechanical. Then came the whispers. Not language, but syllables. guttural and slow, as if someone tried to imitate speech without fully grasping how. I witnessed shapes darting, fast, low figures with limbs too long and mud-smeared over grey skin. In the flickering firelight, I caught glimpses, mostly teeth. Something then hurled a rock at me, hitting the fire pit and sending sparks across my legs. Scout went into a frenzy, barking, snarling, snapping at shadows. I swung the flashlight toward the trees, and that's when I saw them. Eyes high above, watching. I didn't sleep. At first light, I ran in a direction I didn't care about, just moved. Scout followed closely at my side. I stumbled, fell, tore my coat and lost my compass. Around noon, I found a cave, shallow, more like a hole in the cliffside. I hesitated but needed cover. Inside, I was hit by the smell first. Meat and mold, then the bones, piles of them. Animal skulls, a child's shoe, a hiking boot still containing something inside. I turned around, and they were there, 7 or 8 of them, crawling and pale with bent bodies, clicking as they watched. One stood on the ceiling while another sniffed the air, grinning widely, rows of small teeth exposed. Scout lunged, growled, and snapped, buying me 5 precious seconds. I used them, bolting out of the cave and running blindly through the woods. One pursued me as I heard it snapping branches behind, but I didn't look back. Eventually, I broke through to a fire road before sunset and collapsed. A hunter found me hours later, and at the ranger station, the same old man was waiting. He didn't say a word initially, but simply looked at me before pulling out a hand-drawn map. He pointed to a blank spot. "Locals call it Bonefolk Hollow," he stated. "You shouldn't have ventured in there." I inquired if anyone resided there, but he didn't respond. They searched for a week, discovering my camp and the cave, but there were no signs of Scout or the creatures. Just scratch marks, bone piles, and hair samples nobody could identify. I returned to the city and resumed therapy, which helped to some degree. Most nights I sleep fine. It was Halloween night in 2014 when I was 17 and rather oblivious. Not dangerously reckless, but that typical overconfident teenager who hadn't yet faced any significant consequences. I was among 10 of us that night. Me, Jesse, Stephen, Sarah, Todd, Shayna, Brandon, and a few others from our class. Most of them were people I had known since middle school. No one was special, just a bunch of kids trying to pass time, seeking something beyond candy or dressing up. We parked near the old baseball field. My truck's bed was full of junk food, a cooler of soda, and a couple of flashlights. Everyone was lounging around, swapping ghost stories and laughing. Well, fake laughing. You know how it is. Everyone's waiting for someone else to come up with something genuinely entertaining. Jesse ended up being that someone. He waited for a lull in our chatter, then flicked on a flashlight beneath his chin, as if about to share the world's scariest campfire tale. My uncle says, "There's something out past Ridgeway Bluff." A few groans greeted him. He continued. Ridgeway was this wooded expanse up in the mountains about 45 minutes from town. People once hiked there, but the trails had been closed for multiple years. Rumors surrounded the area, stories of missing persons and hikers who never returned, but nobody paid it much mind. The region had that strange small-town mythos to it, always harboring a new eerie spot for kids to dare one another to explore. Jesse pressed on, claiming people lived there long ago, but they weren't right. Born wrong, raised wrong, inbred, or worse. "They don't come down unless they're starving," someone snorted. "Starving for what?" Jesse's grin grew. "Meat," laughter erupted. "That's what happens when you try to prove you're unbothered." But then his tone shifted. "We could go," he proposed. "Find out if anything's out there." The challenge rolled over us. Not the story, not the details, just the dare. We loaded into 2 cars, mine and Jesse's, departing around 11:30. Jesse took the lead in his old Cherokee, while I trailed behind, my truck bed rattling with supplies we had no real use for. Chips, Red Bull, a Bluetooth speaker, and 3 flashlights, one of which barely functioned. The roads declined as we neared Ridgeway. The lines on the asphalt disappeared, then the concrete itself. Soon we were bouncing across gravel and potholes. We passed an old rusted gate left open, almost forgotten, and beyond it, there wasn't even a road. Merely a dirt track veering between trees. We parked where an old clearing used to exist, now overgrown. An old hunting blind rotted away in one corner, half hidden beneath vines. Jesse remarked that the trailhead was near, the only indication being 2 decaying fence posts strung with a sagging chain. I stood there for a moment, flashlight aimed at the woods, but the beam barely threaded through. Everything beyond the logs was simply black, real, solid darkness. Even so, I crossed the chain and followed the others inside. The trail barely qualified as such, mostly just where the grass wasn't growing. We walked single file, parting branches from our faces. As we advanced, the world grew quieter. No wind, no insects, only the sound of 10 pairs of sneakers crunching leaves and some nervous chuckling. After about 20 minutes, the trees opened up, revealing a clearing that appeared unnatural. Someone had built structures, perhaps 5 or 6, each collapsing or halfway there. One leaned precariously to the side. Another had vines streaming through a window, while rusted bed frames jutted out from the grass like exposed bones. One frame still held a mattress blackened with mold. A clothesline stretched between 2 trees, now empty, yet it swayed strangely, as if something had just descended from it. At the far end, built against the hillside, was the root cellar. Its entrance looked like that of a mine. A wooden door cracked with one hinge barely hanging on. It led into total darkness, with our flashlights barely concealing it. For a time, no one uttered a word. We split up, each person probably trying to mask their unease. Sarah and Shana navigated toward the cabins on the left. Brandon and Stephen sped towards the cellar, naturally drawn to the apparent danger. Jesse meandered toward the largest building, acting as if he were on a reconnaissance mission. I lingered near the smallest cabin. I suspected it might collapse if I leaned on it too heavily. Nevertheless, I stepped inside and was immediately struck by a foul odor. Damp fur mingled with something sharp and metallic. Handprints assaulted the walls, small, large, pressed in repeatedly at the same spots. The wood smooth from the constant contact, as if there were some ritualistic nature to it. I hastily backed out, but then I heard movement, not a branch cracking, but something crawling low and fast. I swiveled towards the trees, my flashlight trembling slightly. Nothing. Then movement, quick, low to the ground, too fast for a human, too large for any creature I had encountered. Suddenly, Stephen bolted from the darkness. "There's something out there!" he yelled, causing us all to regroup rapidly. Sarah looked as though she'd encountered something frightening, but hesitated to voice it. Brandon had a bleeding cut on his forehead. "Something threw a rock at him," Jesse declared from the trees. Before we could process that, we heard it, an unsettling giggle. It didn't sound right, almost watery or fractured, not like a child's laughter, but more akin to something trying to mimic a sound that it couldn't quite grasp. Then the stench enveloped us. Rotten meat mixed with burnt hair, the type of smell that gags you reflexively. We scrambled away, no one shouting out or giving orders. We just ran through the underbrush, stumbling and scraping our arms and faces. I swear I noticed something moving beside us just beyond the trees, catching glimpses of long limbs, skin too pale, eyes that didn't catch light correctly. It never chased us. It simply watched, giggling the entire time. We tore through the woods, disregarding the path entirely. As the cars came into view, I almost broke down in tears. We jumped inside, slammed the doors and locked everything, breathing fast and in panic. Then Stephen hissed, "Don't move." We all froze. "There's something behind the car." I slowly turned. Through the fogged rear window, I saw bare, muddy feet. Then a face squished against the glass, eyes too wide, smile too large. And just like that, it dropped from sight. Without waiting for anything more, I slammed the vehicle into reverse, spun around, and didn't stop until we reached the gas station, glowing like a beacon. The car ride back was filled with silence. Nobody uttered a single word. Brandon needed stitches, and Jesse never broached the subject again. Sarah transferred schools the following semester. I moved out of state right after I graduated, telling everyone it was for college, but it wasn't. I've attempted to rediscover that spot. It's invisible on any map. Satellite images glitch out over that area of forest as if someone erased it. My Uncle Ray invited me on a hunting expedition deep into the Appalachian backcountry, framing it as a significant bonding experience, part of a rite of passage. "You'll remember this trip for the rest of your life," he insisted. While he wasn't wrong, it wasn't for the reasons he envisaged. Ray was accompanied by 2 of his old friends, Joe and Marshall, both in their late 40s, men steeped in tales of tracking elk and camping under the stars as if it were a cherished tradition. I was the tag-along, the rookie aiming to prove that I could keep pace with the adult crowd. I didn't mind. I was thrilled to be included, feeling at last like I was part of something. We departed well before dawn. The grumbling of Ray's aging F-150 matched the winding mountain roads that felt as if they were perpetually ascending. I observed the dark sky transition into the brightening grey hues just before sunrise. At last, the pavement gave way to a rugged dirt road, making the truck rattle as though it might disassemble from within. Trees loomed in from both sides, and the road narrowed, transforming into little more than 2 muddy ruts engraved in the earth. At a certain point, Ray halted the truck and declared, "This is it." We unloaded, retrieving our packs, rifles, and a couple of coolers before beginning our hike. It grew quiet, really quiet. No sounds of traffic, no aircraft overhead, no distant barking dogs, just the steady crunch of our boots and the occasional creak from the weight on our backs. As we ventured deeper, it felt as though we were entering a realm where the usual rules no longer applied. There were no trail markers, no fellow hikers, only trees that looked untouched for decades. We hiked for what felt like hours. Around mid-afternoon, we reached a narrow stream nestled within a small clearing, the perfect spot for Ray to decide to set up camp. He surveyed the area and nodded with satisfaction, as if he had discovered a lost world. "Not many folks come out here anymore," he observed, wiping sweat from his brow. "Too much land, not enough reason." We spent the rest of the day getting comfortable, putting up tents, digging a fire pit, and attempting to fish in the stream, to little avail. The air carried that dry, sharp scent of sun-baked leaves and aged bark. It felt remote in a way I hadn't quite experienced before. There wasn't a hint of any man-made sound. Dinner consisted of canned stew consumed from metal bowls, and they passed around a bottle of cheap whiskey. I didn't drink much, just enough to feel accepted in the group. We remained by the fire until it dulled, allowing the stars to fill every inch of the sky. Before long, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep quickly, muscles sore and feet aching. Sudden awakenings came after midnight. The fire had dimmed, while the nearby stream murmured softly, the comforting white noise that had previously helped lull me to sleep. But beneath that familiar sound, something different emerged. Whispers. At first I assumed it was a part of a dream, or perhaps the wind disturbing the trees. But the sounds did not shift as wind does. They circled us. Low, fragmented words. Not exactly English, or at least so faint and twisted that they made no sense. It felt as though someone was speaking underwater. I remained still, straining to decipher. I nudged Ray, who mumbled something before turning, but I persisted, whispering, "Uncle Ray, do you hear that?" He sat up slowly, frowning. "Probably just Joe and Marshall," he muttered. But upon checking, he found their tent zipped tight with their soft snoring reverberating from within. Returning to our tent, an unvoiced acknowledgement hung in the air as we lay there, absorbing the whispers. They drifted through the atmosphere, sometimes near, sometimes far, akin to someone or multiple beings, pacing just outside the fire's illumination. Eventually, the sound faded into the forest's normal background hum. I fell asleep again after a few hours, though it wasn't a restful slumber. The next morning, we were up early, following deer signs along a ridge to the north of our camp. We found tracks and droppings, nothing unusual, until, just beyond an old cedar, we encountered something inexplicable. A complete ring of bones encircling a tree, small fragments, perhaps those of birds or rabbits, meticulously arranged in a circle, bleached white and featuring a little skull resting at the center like an unsettling centerpiece. Initially, we stood there, stunned into silence. Then Ray cleared his throat, suggesting, probably just kids messing around. But his flat tone lacked confidence, revealing uncertainty beneath. We hadn't encountered another human since leaving the truck. No boot prints, no wrappers, no signs of fellow campers or hikers, only endless wilderness. Ray kicked at the bones, scattering them as we proceeded. However, the mood had shifted. We became increasingly cautious, every sound causing us to glance backward. The wind whistling through the trees began to sound too much like breathing. By the time we returned to camp that evening, fatigue had settled in, and we quickly ate without engaging in conversation, struggling to make a dent in the remaining firewood before crawling back into our tents in silence. Sleep eluded me as the woods closed in, reverberating with an unsettling heavy quietness. Expectant, charged. Then the footsteps began, slow and deliberate, just outside the reach of the firelight. You could hear leaves crunching beneath foot, echoing a methodical tempo. Then another set emerged, and yet another, something brushing the side of my tent with fingers that dragged across the fabric. I called for Ray just as Joe shouted from outside in sheer panic. He had stepped out to relieve himself and glimpsed something at the edge of the clearing. We all tumbled out of our tents, rifles in hand. There they stood, figures perhaps 5 or 6, hunched low just beyond the firelight's reach. They resembled scarecrows made of skin and bones, their tangled hair cascading around them, skin so pale it seemed almost grey. They neither spoke nor moved. They simply stared back. Their eyes, reflecting the firelight, lacked the haunting hues of animal eyes, appearing instead as a soft, eerie glimmer, enough to convey they were watching us. Joe raised his rifle, but Ray placed a hand firmly on the barrel, forcing it down. Still, the figures did not flinch. They remained unresponsive. Then, without sound, they melted back into the forest. No snapping branches or rustling leaves, just gone. We didn't sleep again that night. We remained by the fire, backs turned to each other with rifles across our laps. No one uttered a word. At first light, Ray barked, "Pack up now!" There was no argument. Our tents were disassembled in record time, packs hastily assembled without checking what had been left behind. I kept glancing over my shoulder as we hiked out, catching fleeting glimpses of movement between the trees, just enough to make me second-guess if I'd seen anything at all. But I had. They were trailing us, always distant, hovering just beyond my peripheral vision. But they shadowed us all the way back. Upon finally spotting the truck, I nearly broke down in tears. We hurriedly tossed our gear into the vehicle, peeling out without hesitation. Ray didn't ease up until we hit pavement again. The plan was for a getaway, just me and 2 friends, Nate and Jordan, heading into the Appalachian Mountains for an extended weekend. We all needed an escape. I had just finished finals, Nate had quit a job he despised, and Jordan was navigating what she referred to as a romantic detox. It seemed like the ideal moment to vanish into nature, off the grid, without phones or obligations, just the 3 of us in the wild. We had embarked on similar trips before, weekend backpacking excursions, overnighters, trails with whimsical names like Whispering Creek or Panther Gulch. However, this journey delved deeper with a bit more ambition. Armed with an old paper map that Jordan had unearthed online, the sort that folds into 12 sections and carries the nostalgic scent of a grandparent's attic, we planned to hike in, camp for 3 nights, and loop back out. Early Thursday morning, we parked Nate's aging Subaru at a ranger station that appeared to be barely operational and began our hike before noon. The first day was picturesque, a steady uphill climb, shimmering birds, and filtered sunlight weaving through thick greenery. We joked and made silly bets about who would slip in the mud first, even sparring over whether bears could manipulate zippers. Typical trail banter ensued. That night, we settled near a stream, feasting on freeze-dried chili that oddly tasted worse than before. We drifted off to sleep, accompanied by the sound of running water. It felt comforting, peaceful, normal. The second day commenced without issue. We packed up, checked the map, and set off toward a marked ridge. But by late morning, the trail began to fade. Not completely vanished, just tapering off, becoming less trodden and overgrown. Then we stumbled upon it, an offshoot path, wide and sunken, reminiscent of an old road. It had grass and weeds overtaking the center, yet the dirt tracks on either side remained visible if you looked closely. The path curved down into a valley and disappeared beyond a wall of trees. Jordan was the first to notice it. "Hey, you guys see that?" she called, pointing with her trekking pole. Nate squinted. "Is that on the map?" It wasn't. We all felt a strange vibe emanating from it, menacing yet alluring, like one of those old forest roads loggers used before the area received protection. After a brief discussion, we made the decision. Let's follow it for an hour and see where it leads. If it turned into a dead end or grew too eerie, we'd turn back. That would turn out to be our last reasonable choice. As we ventured deeper, the noise around us diminished. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our boots crunching on dirt and the sporadic snap of a branch. The trees began to appear different. Some bent towards one another, creating odd arches, while others grew in twisted spirals or unusual splits, as though intentionally shaped. At one moment, I stopped and focused on a particular tree. Its trunk seemed bound together as if 2 segments had been bent and secured into an arch. My initial assumption was that it was rope. Upon inspecting it more closely, I realized it wasn't rope at all. It was hair. Long, greyish braids, unmistakably human hair, knotting around the tree. It was brittle and dry, yet clearly hair. I opted to remain quiet initially, retreating slightly in my thoughts and keeping up the pace, hoping the others hadn't noticed. But Jordan soon caught up with me a few minutes later and muttered, "That was hair, right?" I nodded soberly. We chose not to discuss it further and continued walking. By late afternoon, we descended into a wide clearing, and that was when things took a serious turn for the bizarre. Scattered throughout were crude, hand-built structures resembling teepees but thicker, composed of sticks, bark, and mud, approximately 8 or 9 arranged in a loose semicircle around a fire pit. Each hut displayed bones at the entrance, little bundles tied with string that clacked together in the gentle breeze. At a loss for how to proceed, we stood indecisively. Jordan insisted we leave immediately, while Nate suggested we investigate further to ensure it wasn't just a hunting camp or some survivalist project. I found merit in both statements but ultimately did nothing. Peeking inside one of the huts revealed a rancid smell. The floor was layered with hides, all stained and blackened by who knows what, alongside a pile of shredded clothing in one corner and a rusted metal spoon embedded upright in the dirt. What truly made me shiver, however, was the sight of a single shoe, a hiking boot with the heel torn off, displaying actual bite marks along the edge. Then a subtle movement drew my attention, a mere shadow shifting, and all three of us turned to look. That's when the first figure stepped into sight. It initially seemed like a small child, thin and short, maybe 4 feet tall, but as it approached, the illusion shattered. Its body appeared too angular, its arms disproportionately long, hair matted and filthy framed its face streaked with ash, the skin stretched tight over its ribs. It didn't utter a sound, only tilted its head and sniffed the air around us. Then it clicked, a sharp, insect-like noise emanating from its mouth. Click, 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 emotionless, void of context, purely mechanical. Soon more figures emerged, stepping out from behind huts, edging from the trees. One dropped to all fours, creeping closer like a dog, while another crouched at the doorway of one hut, observing without any motion. Before long, there were at least a dozen of them, perhaps more, all small, human-like, but inherently wrong. Their skin was smeared with ash and dirt, some painted or marked across their faces, a few grinning with chipped teeth that had been filed to sharp points. They didn't communicate in words, rather they clicked, hissed, or whistled in brief bursts, exchanging sounds like a language unique to them. We were frozen in place. My heart thundered in my chest, and I could hear my own breath too loudly in my ears. One of them crept closer with wide eyes, fingers twitching, sniffing like an animal. Nate whispered, "Don't move, just back away slowly." So we began to inch backward. Unfortunately, Nate's boot crushed a branch. Snap! The sound echoed, sharp as a gunshot. They all moved as one, their chests slapping, feet stomping, shrieks erupting from their throats, high-pitched and chaotic, akin to 1,000 broken radios squawking at once. In that moment, one lunged at me, grasping the strap of my backpack and yanking with such force that I nearly toppled. Its face loomed inches from mine, carrying a stench reminiscent of rotten meat left to fester in the sun. I shoved it away and broke free, and that seemingly small action ignited the chaos. They all charged. I didn't think, I simply ran. Branches tore at my arms and face. Thorns clawed through my sleeves. Jordan screamed behind me. Nate shouted something that I couldn't comprehend through the whirlwind of fear. All that remained was chaos, clicking, shrieking, the sound of feet pounding earth surrounding me. Their speed was alarming, far faster than they should have been. Once, I glanced back, just long enough to witness one leap from a low branch, landing just feet away from me, snarling with eyes reflecting the fading light, pale, wide, and inhuman. I pushed onward, lungs burning and shoes sliding in the mud. I have no idea how long I ran. Everything melded into a blur. I focused solely on moving until the cacophony faded and my legs finally gave out. In the pre-dawn light, I stumbled upon a dirt road, following it until I arrived at a ranger station. I must have looked like I had emerged from a cave, scraped and shaking uncontrollably. They brought me inside, provided water, and asked where my friends were. Attempting to inform them proved challenging. I struggled to form coherent sentences. Search teams were called in, with dogs, gear, and radios ready. I guided them back the route I believed we took, yet nothing matched. The clearing had vanished. No huts, no bones, nothing living remained, only untouched forests surrounding me. Even the bent trees and hair-laden branches had disappeared, as though they had been wiped from existence. Nate and Jordan were never found. Their families distributed posters, offered rewards, and conducted interviews, yet no trace ever emerged. At the age of 26, I took a job that seemed like a decent escape, a government contract that didn't invite too many questions. A college friend of mine, Aaron, was with an environmental survey company and contacted me out of the blue, saying they urgently needed someone. It was a 6-week solo assignment on reclaimed coal land in southern Kentucky. My tasks included taking notes, snapping photos, checking for soil erosion, and documenting any existing structures. He made it sound straightforward. Sure, I'd be alone, but the trailer they provided was stocked with supplies, had a satellite phone, and backup generators. The pay was good enough to wipe my student loans in one go. Stuck in a small apartment with paper-thin walls where I could hear my neighbor chewing gum, I was in dire need of money and a break, so I said yes. They flew me into Louisville, then drove me 4 hours south to a remote town called Mill Creek. After that, it was another hour down a gravel road that hadn't been graded since the Clinton presidency. The trailer sat on a clearing at the forest's edge, surrounded by steep hills. There was no reception, no Wi-Fi, just a satellite phone, with a limited call plan and an old-fashioned two-way radio for emergencies. Initially, it felt peaceful, like camping but more comfortable. I brought books, filled out survey logs by day, and cooked canned food at night. The quiet was strange but not unwelcoming. No cars, no people, no news cycles, just me and the hills. I explored old mining roads, mapped landslides, and photographed collapsed sheds and burnt-out machinery, some of which looked as if they had been purposely destroyed, while other areas showed signs of nature slowly reclaiming the land. On my 4th day, I ventured farther into a gulch I hadn't documented yet. The descent was slow and slick, with moss and wet leaves. The path appeared unused for years. At the bottom, concealed behind a dense wall of brush, was a shack, almost invisible until you were right on top of it. The structure was barely intact, the roof half gone, one wall buckled inward, but inside it seemed lived in, not recently, but not ancient either. Bones were scattered everywhere, clean, white, meticulously arranged. Jawbones lined the windowsills, vertebrae were suspended from the rafters like ornaments, ribs were nailed to the walls, and right in the center of the shack, balanced perfectly on an old rusted pot, was a skull staring at the door as if anticipating my arrival. I refrained from touching anything. I managed to snap a dozen photos before backing out and nearly jogging back up the trail. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was some outsider art or Appalachian oddity, but the image lingered. It felt staged not for someone, but at someone. That night, while reading in bed, I heard footsteps outside. Not animal sounds or twigs snapping, but slow, heavy crunching across the gravel. They circled the trailer once, then halted. A single knock resounded against the back wall. Not hard, just one tap. I froze, my hands gripping the blanket as the silence that followed felt louder than the knock itself. I stayed up all night, waiting for more, but nothing else came. When daybreak finally arrived, I stepped outside, expecting to see footprints or drag marks, but found nothing. No signs anyone had been there. I called in on the satellite phone and informed Ray, my agency contact, that someone might be squatting. He laughed, saying, "You just met the porch possums. They like the smell of chips. They tap on things. You'll get used to it." I didn't pursue it further, not wanting to sound paranoid, but something felt off, and that was just the beginning. 3 nights later, I heard my own voice outside the trailer. It was after midnight, and I was in bed dozing off when I began to hear speech, faint and broken, as if coming from a muffled radio. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then I recognized the words. It was me, saying things I had recorded earlier that day. North Slope Marker 3, slope instability near root cluster. It wasn't playback, but a distorted and slurred version, as if someone was imitating me and not quite getting it right. I grabbed my flashlight, burst out the door, and scanned the tree line. Nothing was there. The next morning, I discovered my truck covered in handprints, small ones too tiny for adults. They smeared across the windshield, mirrors, and even the tailgate. Some looked normal, while others were elongated and clawed, leaving faint scratches down the side panels. My ability to sleep vanished. I blocked the door at night with a folding chair and a heavy chain I found in the closet, keeping a hammer next to me for protection. I stopped turning on lights after dark. The noises kept coming, faint tapping, whispering, sometimes laughter that was raspy and short, like someone was trying to laugh while choking. I reasoned with myself that I just needed to finish my contract. 3 weeks left. Then I saw them. It was late, close to sunset. I had taken a longer route back to avoid the area near the shack, the woods darkening quickly. I crested a ridge and spotted something below, a trio of shapes low to the ground, human-sized but hunched. They moved like marionettes with cut strings, too fast and jerky. One of them stood and turned, face painted and moldy. I couldn't distinguish it clearly, but it was smiling, a wide yellow grin. I bolted, memory blurred, only the pounding of my feet and the slamming of the trailer door behind me registered. Along with the air returning to my lungs after crouching in the corner with my hammer raised, I tried the satellite phone. Nothing. Dead air. I tried again. Still nothing. Then came the final night. It commenced with the typical tapping before escalating to banging that rocked the trailer with each blow. I felt footsteps on the roof, fingers dragging along the siding, followed by a crash as one of the side windows shattered. Something had either thrown something or punched it. I shouted that I had a gun, although I didn't. Then everything fell silent. I remained frozen for what felt like an eternity. Then, from the far corner by the recorder, I heard it, my own voice pleading, "Please, I just want to go home." That was it, I snapped. I unlatched the door, flung it open, and ran barefoot into the woods without looking back. I don't recall the path, only the cuts on my legs from thorns and the fiery sensation in my lungs. I emerged onto the main road at dawn and staggered into the middle like a lunatic. A truck driver swerved and stopped, not even asking questions, just letting me in. I never returned. I didn't ask for the remainder of my check. I didn't care. At 36, I made the choice to leave my job, my lease, my routines, essentially everything, and vanish into the woods. Not because I was having a meltdown, at least not in the sense of screaming into a pillow. I just reached a breaking point. I had spent almost 10 years working in tech support, confined to a grey cubicle beneath fluorescent lights, tackling the same 5 issues daily with clients who despised having to reach out. My back ached, my eyes twitched, and I hadn't engaged in a real conversation in months. My apartment felt like a box. My commute resembled a loop, and every day was like rewinding the same tape. So, I bought a battered 4Runner off Craigslist, cashed out my savings, and stumbled upon a listing for a cabin about 10 miles outside Harland Ridge, Kentucky. The photo depicted a single-room shack without power or plumbing, and windows covered in plastic. It appeared utterly forgotten, intentionally so, and that was ideal. It was positioned at the end of a dirt road no longer maintained. The initial trek took me an hour, crawling up the rough path. The trees leaned ominously over the road, as if concealing the cabin from the world. The interior smelled of wet ash and aged wood. I discovered I wasn't the first occupant. Mice had made themselves at home. The floors creaked beneath my weight, slanted but stable. No phones, no neighbors, no notifications. I salvaged what I could, setting up a rain barrel, a wood stove, and a camp light for the evenings. Half an hour down the mountain, there was a general store boasting a faded Coke sign and a lone gas pump. The owner seemed like he'd been carved from a tree trunk, lean and weathered, consistently donning a green jacket and an old ball cap. During my initial visits, he barely spoke beyond ringing up my purchases: canned beans, jerky, matches, essentials. One day, while rummaging through a bin filled with nails, he finally remarked, "You ain't from around here, are you?" "Lexington?" I acknowledged that I was. "Figured," he replied, nodding slowly. You've got that look. I raised an eyebrow. What look, titty rot, he said, then fixed his gaze down on the cash register, as though such comments were entirely normal. Although we didn't converse much after that, he began incorporating little warnings disguised as advice. Don't leave food outside. Don't walk the woods at night. If you hear voices, make sure to keep your door shut. I initially brushed them off as local superstitions, folklore from the mountains. The first few weeks went smoothly enough. I chopped wood, hiked, even revisited my artistic side. For a time I felt content, finally able to sleep soundly at night. But then the tapping began. It started subtly, just a gentle knock once or twice around midnight. I assumed it might be branches or some critter, but the pattern persisted. Always at the same time, always from the walls, not from the roof or windows, and never just one side. I attempted to ignore it until one night when it tapped 3 times on 3 different walls, one right after the other, sharp and spaced apart as if it was moving around the cabin. That's when I began to keep a shotgun nearby. A few days later, I stumbled upon my first animal, a rabbit laid out on my porch. Its eyes were missing, and its legs were arranged crossed over its chest, as though it were a little corpse in a coffin. There was no blood, just this eerie tidiness, as if it had been handled with extreme care. A week later, I encountered a raccoon with the same arrangement. This prompted me to directly ask Del, "Have you ever seen anything strange out this way?" He hesitated momentarily before taking a sip from a battered thermos and fixing me with a stare. "You burn any of them?" he finally asked. "What? The animals or anything else they leave behind?" I blinked in confusion. "No, I buried them." He nodded sharply. "Good. Don't burn what they give you. It makes them angrier." Who they were, I didn't care to know. A few days after that discussion, I saw one. It was early morning and fog was still lingering. I was walking along a trail I had carved behind the cabin when I noticed something ahead, partially obscured by a poplar tree. At first, it resembled a naked, lost person. Skin pale, arms unnaturally long, hair hanging down in tangled ropes as if it were wet moss. It stood still. I froze and called out, "You okay?" No response. It merely tilted its head. I inched closer, and it ducked behind the tree. By the time I reached the location, it had vanished. No footprints, no rustling, just a void. Then, a strange hum filled my ears, reminiscent of standing near an electric fence. The woods had descended into a dead silence. After that encounter, I refrained from hiking and remained indoors at night, keeping my gun nearby at all times. I began hearing noises outside, footsteps, scraping sounds, and soft breathing. One night, something scratched at my windows for nearly 10 minutes, methodically dragging back and forth. I didn't want to look. I couldn't bring myself to. The final straw involved the roof. It was past midnight, no wind, no rain. I was reading with a flashlight when I heard footsteps on the roof, heavy and deliberate, followed by a dragging noise. Something sharp was being dragged across the shingles, slowly, carefully, not the scurry of an animal, but something circling overhead. I huddled on the floor in darkness until dawn. The next day, I found a bundle of twigs tied with sinew hanging from my front door like a charm. I should have left immediately, but I was furious. I berated myself for being scared. I snatched it, tossed it into the stove, and witnessed it burn. That night they arrived. I'm not talking 1 or 2, I mean dozens. I saw them emerge from the trees just after midnight. Figures moving slowly, some crawling, some limping, all inherently wrong. Their skin was pale, stretched thin, streaked with soot, and what could have been blood. Their eyes caught glimmers of the porch light. They didn't make a sound. One wore a deer skull atop its head. Another dragged what appeared to be a rib cage, wired and stripped. They encircled the cabin and just stared. One even crawled onto the roof. I could hear it thump down, scuttling along the top like a crab. I remained still, unable to move as they gathered tight until dawn finally broke. And then they dissipated. I packed everything that morning, tossing whatever I could into the truck and driving away, not pausing until traffic lights appeared again. Dell didn't seem startled when I returned a week later, looking like I hadn't slept in a year. "They marked you," he stated. "You're now one of the watched." "Watched by what?" I asked. He poured me a shot of something potent and brown. "Used to be people," he replied. "When the mines closed, families got stranded out there. Some went bad, real bad. They changed." He added that they were still human, but not anymore. Now they hunt, but not for food. I now live in a city and work in a coffee shop. I neither hike nor camp. 2 weeks ago, I found a small bundle of twigs tied to my apartment's railing. A few days later, a photo slipped under my door, a picture of my old cabin. The door stood wide open, and in the doorway was one of them. I was only 23 when it all unfolded. My cousin Mark and I were driving through the Appalachians to visit his old college roommate who had relocated to a town outside Knoxville. We could have taken a flight, of course, but being broke, we opted for a road trip instead. Splitting the cost of gas, taking the scenic route, crashing in budget motels. It was all about that low-budget adventure vibe. Both of us were unfamiliar with the South, so we figured the mountains would provide an impressive backdrop for the drive. We planned to stretch the journey over 2 days, perhaps 3 if we discovered a worthwhile stop along the way. Most of our route consisted of backroads, avoiding tolls and traffic since they appeared smarter on the map, more engaging than stretches of mundane freeways. We figured we'd be in Tennessee by the following evening. Easy peasy. Unfortunately, we left later than intended that morning. Nothing dramatic, just a slow packing process, loading snacks, and hitting one too many coffee shops. By the time night settled over the hills, we were still hours away from our designated stop for the night. Mark took the first leg of driving. He managed fine initially until around 10 p.m, but by 11 p.m, fatigue had set in. His eyes reddened, grip lax on the steering wheel, and yawns began slipping from him every few minutes. As we approached a small rest stop ahead, a pull-off with some vending machines, and a lonely flickering light over the restroom door, he pulled in without saying much and declared he needed a short nap. I offered to take over, wide awake from my late afternoon coffee. Driving those unfamiliar country roads at night felt almost spellbinding. The steady hum of the tires. Mark passed out with his hoodie pulled over his face, while the occasional curve in the road cut through the trees, as if we were navigating through a tunnel. Eventually, I rolled the windows down a bit to let in some air. It felt refreshing. That leg of the drive continued smoothly for a while. Suddenly, my GPS emitted a ping indicating a rock slide ahead with a proposed detour. It looked like it would take a little longer. About 45 additional minutes. I hit the accept button and carried on. The road transitioned quickly, still paved at first, but soon showing signs of neglect. Cracked blacktop and overgrown shoulders necessitated slowing down for the sharp bends. With each passing mile, it felt tighter and more enclosed. I kept reassuring myself that perhaps it was just the nature of mountainside roads. No shoulder, barely visible lines. A winding path led into the unknown. 30 minutes later, we passed a dilapidated wooden sign leaning haphazardly in the weeds. Most of the paint had chipped away, but I managed to discern the remaining words: Hollow Ridge. Laughing under my breath, I kept driving further. The road took a turn for the worse after that sign, as the pavement abruptly gave way to gravel, rough and uneven. My tires kicked up loose stones while the entire vehicle rattled violently with every jolt. I slowed down, squinting through the front windshield, hoping that going slower would lessen the ominous feeling of the journey. A hesitant thought crossed my mind. Maybe turning back would be wiser. I did consider it, but the GPS continued showing our route, and there were no other roads out in this desolate expanse. No cell signal remained too, only that frozen map displaying our little blue line inching forward. Mark remained undisturbed, curled against the passenger door and breathing evenly. I reassured myself, believing that as long as the road continued, we would inevitably emerge from it. But it felt as though we were getting nowhere. Incessant trees surrounded us while darkness closed in, devoid of lights, signs, mailboxes, or even reflectors hammered to posts, just snug. Winding paths and endless woods. The deeper I drove, the heavier the air felt, not necessarily in a mystical way, rather dense and stagnant, like nothing had shifted in those woods for hours. Then I noticed the first figure, standing to the right of the road, perhaps 10 feet back and nestled between 2 trees. I initially believed it to be a branch or a rock, a trick of the light. As my headlights swept over, the figure's details were revealed. Shirtless, pale, long and tangled hair, arms hanging limply at its sides, and a gaze that reflected just enough light to indicate it was watching us. I tightened my grip on the wheel, murmuring to myself that it was probably just a local, a hiker, or someone who resided in the region. Creepy certainly, but not impossible. Then I noticed another figure crouched low by a ditch, turning its head to watch us as we passed. It didn't move an inch. Figures began appearing every few minutes, then at each turn, and soon were seen every 100 feet. One sat cross-legged on the gravel shoulder, another leaning against a tree with its hand resting flat against the trunk, and yet another perched on a low rock, as if it had been waiting for hours. All barefoot, all eerily quiet. None uttered a sound, merely fixated their gazes on our passing vehicle. I drove through what felt like a gauntlet of silent statues without uttering a word. My mouth felt dry and my heartbeat quickened. An indescribable dread bubbled up within me, intensifying my need to keep moving. If I slowed or halted the vehicle, I just knew it would turn worse. After some time, Mark stirred. The car jolted from a particularly nasty dip, enough to rouse him from slumber. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked around and tensed at once. "What road is this?" he asked, voice thick from sleep. "Just following the GPS," I replied, attempting to maintain a cool demeanor, though my voice wavered regardless. He turned toward the window and froze, and I could see the moment the realization hit him, his posture stiffening as he grasped what I was trying to overlook. "What the hell?" he muttered. That's when the first rock struck. A sharp thud as it hit the passenger door, followed by another that landed hard on the roof, echoing inside the car. Mark ducked instinctively and yelled, "Go, just go!" I slammed the gas down hard. The tires spun on loose gravel before finally catching traction. The car lurched forward as additional rocks flew, one cracking the side mirror and another bouncing off the windshield hard enough to make me flinch. We couldn't see where they were coming from, merely shadows and flashes of pale figures moving among the trees. Mark curled down low in his seat, arms shielding his head, while I gripped the wheel with white knuckles, my hands aching under the pressure. The road twisted and dipped, jerking us around, but I refused to slow down for anything. I had to keep going, driven by a primal instinct that told me to forge ahead. There was no turning back now. No matter how long we drove, 10 minutes or 30, I couldn't tell. Eventually, the road began to widen slightly. Gravel transitioned back into buckled asphalt, and while it wasn't smooth sailing, it was certainly better than before. I spotted faint lights ahead, a gas station. I aimed for it and pulled in with a screech, throwing the car into park without a second thought. Both of us stumbled out, legs unsteady and knees buckling as though we hadn't moved in ages. The car bore the scars of its ordeal, with dents littering its body and deep scratches carved down both sides. The roof was pockmarked by impacts resembling a fist. The clerk exited upon hearing the engine's roar, first eyeing the car, then us, returning to the vehicle as if attempting to gauge how we had emerged from a nightmare. He asked from which road we had come, and I answered, "Hollow Ridge." His demeanor hardened, withholding surprise or fear, as if he had grown tired of hearing that name. "That's not a place you'd want to drive through at night," he stated flatly. No further explanation, just that succinct warning. We filled up the tank, grabbed some energy drinks, and left in haste. We slid back onto the highway and stayed on it for the remainder of our trip. To this day, we seldom discuss that night, even after several years have passed. My cousin Aaron had been persistently attempting to pull me into one of his notorious mountain adventures for what felt like eternity. Each family gathering and phone call featured his inevitable pitches, overflowing with bizarre tales of unmapped caves or trails so overgrown that even the boots beneath your feet vanished from view. He was fixated on the thrill of escaping to remote places, seemingly more alive the further into the wild he ventured. Conversely, I leaned towards cell service, paved roads, and not having to eat from a Ziploc bag. Yet I hadn't seen him in quite a while, and when he called that summer, delivering one of his elaborate, "You'll regret it if you say no" monologues, I acquiesced. I figured a week in the Appalachian backwoods would be manageable, just to challenge myself, with the worst-case scenario being a few sore legs and some entertaining anecdotes. However, I soon discovered he meant that I'd remember this trip for entirely different reasons. The first couple of days were exhausting but tolerable. I hadn't engaged in this level of hiking for ages, and my body quickly reminded me of that fact. Meanwhile, Aaron thrived, bounding ahead, eager to share his knowledge. He pointed out edible plants and bear tracks continuously, constantly referring to a wrinkled old topographic map he practically had memorized. I did my best to keep up without twisting an ankle. The trails narrowed as we pressed on until they no longer resembled paths, merely faint impressions in the underbrush alongside animal trails and dry stream beds. Still, Aaron reassured me that he knew the way. He claimed we were headed for somewhere special, emphasizing that few people make it this deep. It was on the third day that anxiety began to creep in. Upon awakening that morning, I noticed the trees around our camp had been stripped. Not entirely, just enough to catch my attention. Long vertical patches of bark had been ripped off, exposing rough wood beneath. At first, I assumed it was storm damage, but the pattern struck me as too intentional. These weren't claw marks, and they certainly didn't appear to be the result of lightning strikes. It looked as if something had seized the bark and yanked it away. Deep gouges, uneven and almost aggressive. Aaron regarded the marks with casual indifference, shrugging them off with a "could be bears," while chewing on a protein bar. I traced my fingers delicately over one of the marks, feeling the splintered texture. "This high up on the trunk?" I inquired. He didn't provide an answer, merely continued packing as if it were of no concern. That afternoon, we crossed a ridge leading into a valley that felt entirely different from the others. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The air grew denser, as though the sky had descended closer. It was dead quiet, not peacefully silent, but eerily so. Even Aaron surveyed his surroundings with mild unease. In that valley, we stumbled upon a shack. Half collapsed and ensconced in moss, it seemed to sink into the earth. Yet strips of ash near the entrance suggested some recent disturbance. Branches lay fractured along the trail leading to its door. The strong scent of mold and rot permeated the air within. Inside, a beam had collapsed from the roof, crushing part of a table in the corner. Arranged upon the table were bones, deliberate placements, indicating that someone had meticulously arranged them rather than scattering them carelessly, creating little bundles tied neatly with bits of twine and feathers. My eyes drifted to the dirt floor, where I saw tracks, footprints, but not those you'd expect to find. No boot prints, no evidence of tread. These were bare feet, dozens of them, some small, some larger. Impressions sitting starkly in the soil, fresh-looking and smudged as though they had been tampered with multiple times. The uneasy sensation surged through me. I could feel the tension clinging to the air. Aaron tried to downplay the finding, but I could observe the way he was breathing. It had grown shallow. He muttered something about people living off the grid, but his eyes reflected my thoughts. These weren't the kind of folks anyone would want to meet. We wasted no time in vacating the shack. Little was said for the remainder of the day as we kept glancing behind us, not due to actual sounds, but rather an acute sensation of being watched. Occasionally, movement caught my eye from the ridges above. On one instance, I could have sworn I saw someone stooped behind a fallen log, pale skin and dark hair, simply observing us. I blinked and they vanished. That night, we didn't bother lighting a fire. Instead, we sat in the lingering darkness, trying to minimize noise. Once again, the forest fell into silence. No buzzing insects, no owls hooting, nothing. Suddenly, we started hearing movement, soft, deliberate noises encircling us. The footsteps remained just distant enough for us not to see their source. Every so often, a branch would snap, or leaves would crunch, with something softly thudding against the earth. "Are you hearing this?" I whispered. Aaron, although visibly disconcerted, didn't respond. I noticed his grip tighten around the knife he was clutching in his lap. Sometime after midnight, the tapping began. Small stones were tossed one by one with intention, neither random nor frantic, but organized, hitting trees before sinking into silence, only for another to follow. A complete circle formed around us, just out of range of our flashlights. That turned out to be the longest night of my existence. When dawn broke, we wasted no time. Packing food or water was the last thing on our minds. We merely walked. Yet, everything felt different. It was as though the woods had shifted. The paths warped into illogical directions. We followed one stream only to end up at the same crossing point an hour later. Trees we had marked were gone, leaving only confusion in their wake. Aaron halted, his attention fixated on the map, which now appeared to him as if written in a foreign language. He mumbled to himself while flipping it over, checking the compass repeatedly. At that moment, I realized we were not merely lost. We were being shepherded. Later that day, as we paused at a stream to fill our water bottles, I bent down, dipping mine into the refreshing water. Upon looking up, I noticed 3 figures crouched low across the bank, covered in mud, their hair tangled into thick ropes, eyes wide and staring, yet perfectly still. Then, as if choreographed, they ducked and vanished into the underbrush. Aaron saw them too. I didn't need to ask. No words were exchanged as we hastened our pace, feeling as if the forest itself was inhaling us. The trees leaned too closely, paths twisted unpredictably. Our own footprints would vanish behind us, erased without a trace. We didn't stop until the looming shadows forced us into a reluctant halt. We set up the tent but found no solace there. Our rest was eluded by whispers in the forest. Not words, only sounds, breaths intertwining, movements that didn't align with wildlife, and every few minutes, something would brush against the tent walls, gently and slowly, as though fingers were dragging across the fabric. Morning came with our nylon tent smeared with mud across 5 long strokes, each one prototype-sized against it. It was Aaron who finally admitted defeat. He stopped pretending, allowing the panic to seep through in his voice as he packed his gear. "I don't know where we are," he admitted. He didn't try to hide the truth any longer. The mountains appeared unfamiliar. The sun rose where it shouldn't have, casting shadows in directions that felt wrong. That evening, we stumbled upon another shack, this one intact, with smoke trailing lazily from a hole in the roof and animal hides nailed to its walls, still glistening with fresh remnants. Before we had the chance to react, the door creaked open, revealing a man, skin scarred and cracked, with a patchy beard and hollow eyes, colorless and expressionless. Behind him, in the threshold, more faces appeared, lined up unnervingly, all pale and silent. Aaron tried to articulate that we were lost, holding up the map as if it bore significance. "We're lost," he stammered nervously. The man didn't even glance at the map. Instead, he offered a smile, stretching too far, revealing crooked and yellow teeth. Then he whistled. In an instant, the forest came alive. Footsteps thundered, voices hissed, branches snapped. Figures raced among the trees, crawling swiftly, hands and feet pounding the earth. Aaron screamed and bolted. I followed suit. Branches tearing at us and thorns battering my shins. I didn't dare look back. My only instinct was to run. While I continued onward, hearing the chaotic laughter of those behind us, I couldn't shake the sensation of being hunted. Aaron's footsteps came to an abrupt halt, followed by his sheer scream. Then all fell silent. I pressed forward, glancing back over my shoulder occasionally, but pushing ahead as the trees thinned, and I broke through to the gravel road. I finally collapsed, exhausted. Minutes later, a truck drove by, nearly swerving to avoid me. Weeks passed with searches of the woods. They turned up nothing. No sign of Aaron, no indication of the shack, nothing at all. We lived in a trailer just outside a dot of a town called Wren Hollow, a place you wouldn't find on a map unless you actively sought it. Even then, most people just drove past without a second glance. Tucked deep in the Appalachian foothills and enveloped by dense woods, it felt as if the trees were leaning in to listen. Our road barely qualified as one, mostly patched gravel and broken blacktop, inhabited only by rusted trucks, stray dogs, and an unsettling silence that didn't invite questions. The trailer backed up against what the locals referred to as the holler, a term for the curve between hills where trees grew denser. Sound behaved strangely there, and wandering aimlessly was ill-advised without knowing that someone or something might be watching. I didn't have many friends. I was quiet and sensitive to noise, flinching when people got too close. Back then, no one used terms like autistic or sensory issues. In Wren Hollow, you were merely considered a bit off, a touch affected. If you were lucky, they left you alone. If not, you wished they had. But the woods had no such judgment. Out there, I felt at peace, anchored. I would pack a sketchbook and spend hours capturing the minutiae of tree knots, ant trails, and dead birds, anything that caught my attention. My mum never inquired about my activities as long as I returned before sundown. She thought me harmless. My dad was quieter still. The day everything began was just another unremarkable October afternoon, which is the thing about terrible events. The world doesn't broadcast warnings. There's no thunderous clap or eerie score, just the mundane thought that you're going outside to sketch a skull. I had found a little raccoon skull by the creek 2 weeks earlier and stashed it beneath a birch tree with the crooked trunk, the one perpetually covered in green moss. I told my mum I would return by dinner and she waved me off, her attention absorbed in her game show. I followed my usual trail, crunching leaves beneath my sneakers, feeling the scratch of dry branches against my hoodie. Everything felt ordinary. I hugged my sketchbook tightly and settled down, crossing my legs to work. The skull looked even better in the daylight than I remembered. I had been so immersed in my drawing that I barely noticed the silence gradually enveloping me. There was no fade out, just the abrupt absence of bird calls. It was as though I had walked into a room only to forget my purpose. The thick silence felt heavy. It rang in my ears. Then came a whistling tune that was off-key, Not a recognizable song, but 5 or 6 repeated notes in a haphazard loop. It sounded like someone attempting to recall a melody they had only half heard long ago. I held my breath, trying to tune in closer. The sound was coming from deeper within the woods, not behind me. And then it called my name, drawn out, sing-songy, unnaturally high, like a child mimicking an adult. That's what made it so chilling. It was pretending. I don't remember standing up. All I recall is running. The sketchbook fell to the ground. My foot hit a root, sending me sprawling into the dirt. I scrambled back up and continued to run. Each tree felt too near. Every shadow felt inaccurate. I didn't halt until I saw the trailer through the trees and crashed against it, gasping for breath. My dad lay under the truck, listening to an old country song on the radio. He glanced over but didn't inquire. I told him about the whistle that said my name. He didn't go any further than a blink, spitting into the dirt, muttering, "Probably a barn owl. Sounds like a woman screaming. Freaky, but nothing to worry about. Except owls don't say your name, and they don't grin." A week later, Jesse, a boy a grade above me, vanished. He was a bully who relished yanking my backpack down the school bus steps. They claimed he was last seen heading to the creek behind his house. People turned up in droves searching. Dogs, ATVs, the entire town joined in. They didn't uncover much. A piece of his hoodie, bare footprints by the water. However, they were neither child-sized nor adult-sized, but something in between. My parents then decreed I mustn't venture beyond the yard. I didn't argue, but the whistling returned late at night, always faint, always offbeat. Sometimes it circled the trailer. Lying in bed, I'd hold my breath, attempting to convince myself it was merely the wind. Once I saw thin fingers pressed gently against the screen of my bedroom window. I stopped sleeping. I stopped drawing. My mum said I needed to cut back on horror movies, while my dad threw me his old slingshot, suggesting, "Next time it whistles, you whistle back." I laughed, as if it was a joke, but it was no laughing matter. The worst night arrived in March. I couldn't find any rest, so the living room couch had become my go-to spot. I thought maybe if I stayed closer to the front of the house, it couldn't get as near. Around 2 a.m., I awoke, drenched in sweat. Not scared, just alert, as though my body instinctively knew. The first blow was the smell. Damp earth mingled with iron, reminiscent of a broken nose, like a graveyard's odor had mixed with that of earth. I propped myself up and peered outside. It crouched just beyond the tree line. Not standing, not crawling, but merely squatting. Long arms dangled low, fingertips buried in the dirt. Its skin was a blotchy pale grey smeared with mud. No clothing, just its skin and grime. Its face looked slack with wide eyes that didn't blink. Then it smiled. Not a joyful smile, but a puzzled one, as if it had seen people smile and wanted to imitate it. It stood bent backward, as if its spine didn't comprehend which way was up, and let out that whistle. I screamed. My dad burst out the door with his rifle, yelling into the darkness. There was nothing, no sounds, just trees. By dawn, my mom had packed our bags without discussion. We left before the sun rose. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. Not that I had anyone to bid farewell. We stayed with my aunt in Kentucky. A different town, different rules. My parents never mentioned the incident again, but they changed. My dad kept a bat by the bed, while my mom ceased playing music around the house. Even the atmosphere shifted. Years passed. I left home, began a tech job, and moved to a city where trees were merely a distant memory. I never told anyone.